Hi, my name is Maeve Willis. I'm excited to connect with you all virtually today for this presentation as a part of this summit. My talk today is entitled Be Your Own Superhero, and ultimately we're going to speak a little bit about the impact of shame and advocacy among individuals with food allergies. I'm a current Master's of Social Work degree candidate at The Ohio State University. I use she, her, hers as my pronouns, and I'm allergic to peanuts, nuts, dairy, eggs, and seeds. So initially, I would like to invite you to play somewhat of a game. This is something that works a little bit less effectively since we are virtual, but I simply invite you to consider whether or not this statement applies to you or not. So the game is called I'm Cool and You're Cool Too If. And typically speaking, in a shared setting, we'd be able to understand how many people in this shared space have experienced something similar to this, but I simply invite you to reflect on whether or not this is an experience that you understand. So, I am cool, and you're cool too if you've ever brought your own dessert to someone else's birthday party, if you've had someone make light of your food allergies, if you've had a reaction while in a city away from home, if you have stopped doing something that you love because of your allergies, if you have carried a very classy fanny pack for your EpiPens, if you have had to explain the difference between dislike, intolerance, and allergies, if someone has joked that you should live in a bubble, if you relate better to others with chronic illnesses than those without them, if you've ever wondered while having a reaction if this might be the one that gets you, if you ate lunch in the nurse's office as a child, if you sold your Halloween candy with allergens for a profit, if you hid in the bathroom on Halloween at school because you didn't like making teachers feel conscious of their accidental exclusion of you, if you ate at the same restaurant for every night of a trip because you felt you could trust it, if you felt like your allergies were inconveniencing someone despite their assurances otherwise, if you have introduced yourself using your name, pronouns, and allergies to a stranger, if you have been jealous of a friend or sibling without food allergies, and if you have felt grateful for the insights into the world that food allergies have brought you. Because of the strict avoidance culture perpetuated by allergy and immunology physicians over the last 25 years, social isolation has become a natural but unintended and unrecognized consequence as a result. If you were the kid who ate lunch in the nurse's office in order to avoid any potential contamination with food, otherwise speaking, in the lunchroom, now you are also socializing as an 8-year-old with predominantly 65-year-old women. As a result of this can ultimately then create that conflict where now there is that unspoken common denominator here of shame that spans across all of those different elements of those statements that we just shared together. So I want to speak today about two different ultimate areas. Number one, the structure of daily adaptations, and then number two, what happens when you do have a reaction, because the shame and advocacy for both of those instances is quite different. So in order to first consider daily adaptations, you must ultimately then consider the progression of age as a result of that as well. As you increase in age from elementary school to high school to college, and college to a professional experience, the structure that the student themselves has and the autonomy and independence of that student shifts as well, shifting from extremely structured to a professional experience that is entirely dependent on career and community. And then in an autonomy sort of a sense, as an elementary school student, you have no independence. Everything is set in stone and is structured to ensure and to minimize as much risk as possible, transitioning then ultimately into a professional experience where you do have full autonomy. This ultimately then means that quite a bit of these experiences are ones that you need to learn, and that you will learn at different points in your life depending on the structure and the autonomy that's in place. As a high school student, your structure on a day-to-day basis is considerably less structured, but is still relatively predictable. As you progress then to college, Things are even more loosely structured, but are still ultimately contained to a college campus. And so there is ultimately then a level of predictability in terms of the food exposures that you may have. As you progress then into a professional experience, it's entirely dependent on your career and in your community that you are a part of. This past year at last year's Food Allergy Summit, I spoke with Sarah Ackerman, who at the time was in the acting community. Her roles then shifted every few months, and as a result, lots of meetings needed to take place over food. And so she found that she needed to advocate for herself quite a bit. I come from a higher education background where a fair amount of my exposures were limited to both colleges and high school campuses. As a result, I was inherently surrounded by things that were relatively structured and relatively predictable. And so our two professional experiences at the time were quite vastly different. And all of this is something that is necessary to consider, frustratingly so, but necessarily so. The same is true then for autonomy as well. As you increase in the amount of independence that you have as a high school student, you may begin to experiment maybe once a week with friends, maybe once a month with friends. And that only increases as you then move into your college experience, where ultimately then as a professional, you have full autonomy. You choose what you eat, where you eat, how often you change what you eat, and how all of that then ultimately impacts your daily social life as well. And so all of these must be considered. Now, this past year, I created a business card that I happily hand out to every server that I interact with. And this is an exact copy replica of something that I would hand to a server. I felt it necessary to include that eggs included egg wash and mayonnaise. I felt it necessary to include that seeds included tahini. There are many instances where I recognized that questions that I had been asked that I thought were plain and clear were apparently less so for everyday Americans. And so I felt that it was important to include things like this. I encourage you to take this structure and build on it in whatever way you see fit, both from an advocacy sense as well as a specific food allergy sense for anything that you're a part of. But the more that you are able to rely on structural things like this, having a set of 20 of these in your wallet as you are prepared to go out for a trip or something similar like that, the more then that you will be able to create structure as a professional, as a college student, as a high school student, where structure may not necessarily ultimately exist. The more that you are able to control your experiences, the more that you are able to then have flexibility within those experiences to enjoy the social components that come along with joining others around food. So moving now into emergency room advocacy. This is important to consider both from a patient-oriented perspective as well as a caregiver perspective, and I'm going to speak about both. So from a patient perspective, the first time that you experience something negative, be that an actual reaction or something that feels shameful as a result of having food allergies, essentially you mentally minimize that down into a victim mentality. You then progress into a survivor mentality and then progressively accept that as part of yourself. And with each ultimate exposure to something else, be that a food itself or something shameful that you then need to mentally progress and work through, you progress back to that initial victim mentality and then through again that survivor and acceptance pattern until ultimately this is a faster pattern each time you are exposed either to a new food or to a new potentially shameful experience. But what's important to consider here is the research that has been done relatively recently on what's called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And we know that the more ACEs a child has, the higher an ACE score, the more likely early death, whether that was a result of that experience or not. The ultimate compounding factors, such as social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the higher risk behaviors that you choose then to adopt as a result of those cognitive impairments, all of those things ultimately progress to an early death, whether that early death is from food allergies or not. And so I acknowledge this not to scare you, the patient, or you, the caregiver, but to acknowledge that each time something like this happens, we need to address what's going on, both from a mental standpoint as well as from a wellness standpoint. Because if we ignore one in favor of only the other, we're not considering the long-term ramifications then of ultimately how food allergies impact people in their daily lives. Now, as you consider the caregiver perspective as well, this is incredibly important as a patient begins to age. In particular, when transitioning from high school to college and college into that professional world, now that patient has ultimately potentially left for the first time their cohesive caregiving unit. And so now this victim, the major difference between these two sides is that progressing from this victim mentality to survivor to acceptance for the patient has become something that is relatively ingrained. It is relatively easy for them to understand that when I feel shameful, I can just work myself through to that survivor mentality and then work myself through to accepting that part of myself. And that as each experience brings that patient back to victimhood, it is easier to then progress through to that acceptance level. But this is not necessarily the case for an unpracticed person. And so as someone progresses from high school to college, from college to the professional world, the more times that a new caregiver, a new friend, a new boyfriend, a new girlfriend, a new cohesive unit that supports that patient, each time someone is now exposed to that victim mentality, they are not as practiced at getting themselves out of it. And so all of a sudden now, the patient is not only tasked with progressing themselves through to that acceptance state, but now they're tasked with giving care to their caregiver, where now they're asking that caregiver to work with them a little bit and progress quite quickly through the survivor and the acceptance stages where they may feel a little stuck. And so now what is important to consider is that each time a patient might have an adverse reaction or may have a mentally shameful experience as a result of having food allergies, the community that they surround themselves with ultimately encourages them or discourages them from getting to that acceptance stage at the same rate. And so what I encourage you teens and young adults to consider is the type of community and the way that you are communicating about your food allergies in your life. The more people that you have in your life that understand your food allergies, that understand how it feels to have those accepted, both from a mental standpoint and from a physiological standpoint, the easier it will be on you as well to then progress into somewhat of a more safe environment. So after emergency room encounters, it's important to consider several different strategies as well as different components for that type of advocacy. There are 3 different essential ways that I consider advocacy as you are working with organizations. So in particular, you want to address where the mistake was within that organization. What was the fault? Was it on you as the person? Did you not advocate enough? Did you not check the ingredients list? Where did the systems and the structure that you've put in place fall short? If necessary as well, it can be helpful and potentially necessary to interact and to advocate with an ambulance medic organization as well as the emergency room. Unfortunately, there are plenty of myths circulating within medicine today where food allergies and allergic reactions are not as understood as we wish they were. And so this needs to be an ultimate area of education for ambulances and emergency room physicians and staff as well. And so that can be something that potentially may need to be considered as you consider who you would like to advocate for after having an emergency room reaction. As well, I encourage you to think about preemptive advocacy. If there's an organization or a lifestyle that you wish to adopt where you understand that you need to be in a safe space as you are enacting part of that lifestyle, preemptive advocacy does have its place. But as well as you are considering those elements of advocacy, it's also important to understand where you fit into that advocacy image, as well as the humanity of the other people on the other side of the phone. It's important, yes, to consider the severity of a mistake that may have been made and the potential livelihood of the impact on that patient. I don't underestimate the fact that there are definitely people who are attending this conference this weekend who have lost loved ones as a result of food allergies. And so underestimating or understating the impact of these types of conversations is not something that I want to encourage. However, I do want to encourage that you understand the humanity of the person who made the mistake. If you bypass that humanity, or if you undersell the severity of the mistake, the communication can potentially be lost, and the degree of the change then that you're ultimately able to have can be quite lessened. And so this is not necessarily a chance where I would encourage you to enact anger, but is a place where I would encourage you to consider with caution both your own livelihood, if you are the patient, but as well the personhood of the one answering the phone. As well, I would encourage you to consider the degree of the suggested changes that you are making. And I will use Bub City as an example for this as well. So Bub City was a restaurant that I attended in Rockford, Illinois, several years back. I did ultimately have a reaction at this barbecue restaurant as a result of an oversight in the kitchen. However, I chose not to sue the company. I chose not to take any sort of legal action because I felt compelled to advocate for both myself and the food allergy community in a different light. And so after that reaction, I called and spoke with the manager of the restaurant, who then forwarded me on to the overseeing company, who then actually ran several hundred restaurants in the state of Illinois. We spoke for several hours on that day, and as a result of that conversation, that owner then enacted food allergy education onboarding, both for kitchen staff as well as serving staff, for that entire chain of restaurants. And so rather than ultimately just firing one server or firing one member of the kitchen staff for oversight, now I was able to enact a much greater degree of change in all of those restaurants. I then followed up with a phone call with that same person several years later, and he was able to share with me that as a result of that conversation, they had more serious considerations about their food allergy protocol in all of those restaurants. And now every time a server approaches a table, they introduce themselves, and the first question that they ask is if there are any food allergies or insensitivities that they need to consider in the party. Those sorts of changes would not have been possible had I approached that in any different light. And so I encourage you to understand that you actually have the potential to have a really strong degree of change, and your advocacy genuinely does matter, but only if you understand the power of your voice. I included the other two images here, both for Ohio State University and JetBlue, because these are both other examples of advocacy routes that I've taken. With Ohio State, several months ago, I incurred an allergic reaction and was not believed in the emergency room. As a result, I enacted a formal complaint with the ambulance service that ultimately brought me to the emergency room and had assessed that I was having a panic attack rather than an episode of anaphylaxis. And the same thing was true with the physicians in that emergency room. And so as a result of that, then educational changes were made both to that organization so that something like that would not happen again. Again, this is not something where anger or frustration was going to get me anywhere, but going through those formal channels and encouraging that type of education really did matter. With JetBlue, I preemptively called them after understanding that they were offering what they called a peanut-free buffer zone on planes. And so my understanding now is that the row in front and the row behind for JetBlue flights of any food allergy patient is introduced that there is someone in the vicinity with a food allergy, and they are offered snacks to exchange for any snacks that they do have, nuts. This, to me, is an incredible step forward, and I don't understand why this is not a more widely practiced space, but I was able to connect with two of the women who help run the disability policies with JetBlue to understand how they go about enacting advocacy suggestions from clients, and understand then how I could apply those policies then to other organizations as well. This was a preemptive phone call, and now my alliance is going to forever be with JetBlue because of my gratitude for the severity that they understand food allergies to be. This image is one of my favorite from the movie Finding Nemo, and this scene indicates the time at the end of the movie where all of the fish finally are able to roll themselves into the ocean in their bags, having successfully escaped the fish tank in Australia. And after sitting here for several moments, one of the fish asks, "Now what?" And it's a great question. Now what? Now that we understand that food allergies can potentially have adverse impacts on general populations, not only those who are actually experiencing those food allergies, but as well those caregivers, those friends, those members of the community too. Now what? Now what do we do with that? Because action must be taken in order to enact any change. And so I'd like to leave you with this final image here. Both of these images depict both Supergirl and Superman, also known as Kara Danvers and Clark Kent. Supergirl and Superman are incredibly well recognized. That symbol on their chest stands for Stronger Together, and they are now world renowned as superheroes, people who represent an unimaginable amount of power and change and advocacy for good. At the same time, both of these characters in the DC Comics universe represent people who represent the press. So Clark Kent being a photographer and Kara Danvers being a reporter. And through both of those roles, they make micro-oriented differences on a much different scale, and there is no argument as to whether or not one is more valuable than the other. And so what I encourage you to think about is not only who are you in terms of your identity, but how can you have the greatest impact on the world that you currently interact with? Are you someone who is more likely or more apt to have that macro-oriented difference? Are you someone who is more likely to have a micro-oriented difference? Either one has validity and is necessary. And so what I encourage you to think about as you move forward from today is, what can you do in the world that we're currently facing? Are you someone who's going to make change in an entire chain of restaurants in Illinois? Or are you just going to make change for one family who's being served by you, and you ask them, do you have any food allergies? Either one is entirely valid and makes a difference and saves lives, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. But one is not lesser than the other. And if you choose to create a platform through some other means outside of food allergies and use that platform to then advocate and educate when it comes to food allergies, that has as much validity as creating a platform within food allergies and using that to then further other means as well. And so all we are tasked with is making the world a better place. It doesn't matter which orientation you choose. Thank you so much, and let me know if you have any questions.